afternoon, everybody. I'm Carla Strand. I am Secretary of the League of Women Voters. Thank you all for being here. This is a great crowd. We have really a good program today on how do we get our news. And this was prompted after League discussion about staff layoffs and ownership changes at the Salina Journal. It was a concern to League members. It's been a concern in the Salina community, and that's why we decided to have this program. How to get your local news. When there is or isn't any, that's been subtitled. This is going to feature two people. Mike Strand over here, who is a former journalist with the Salina Journal, other newspapers in Kansas. He has about 30 years experience starting during his college days at Wichita State University. Also, Mike also worked at newspapers in Oklahoma. We don't want to forget about that, do we, Mike? Right now, he is marketing specialist at Salina Area Technical College. Paul Green was supposed to come to this program, but he had work obligations. So James Talley very graciously stepped in at the last minute to come and speak with us. And yes, James, I really am going to read this. James was part of Friendly Fire on KSAL for a number of years. He's written a weekly column for the Salina Journal for a few years, and he's also given consideration to news quality over many years. He studied political science and sociology at Fort Hays State University. This program is the first of 3 League of Women Voters programs that are planned for this fall. These lunch and learn programs they last for about an hour and 15 minutes. They focus on local and national issues, open to the public. Also, I want to remind you, we do have cookies at the back. Also, please sign in when you leave if you didn't sign in when you came in. And I guess without further things, Mike, take it away.
I'm going to start kind of roadmap where we're going to go. Question I hear from a lot of people is what happened at the Journal all of a sudden, and so we're going to talk a little bit about history of newspapers in Kansas, how the business model works, what happened. First of all, the all of a sudden part. Newspaper readership, as you can see, the eagle at the top, that top blue line there has been a little bit of an anomaly in the 70s, but you can see a steady downward trend at Wichita Eagle, Capital Journal, Salina Journal. Smaller papers tended to be less affected over time. Big metros were most affected. Papers the size of Salina and Hutchinson, kind of in between in terms of the effect of just generally declining readership, but I wanted that there for perspective first. When I first got into newspapers after college in 1988, 89, Kansas was pretty much dominated by, outside of Wichita, which was Knight Ridder, a big nationwide chain. Most of the larger papers in Kansas were owned by either Harris Enterprises, based in Hutchinson, which also owns Salina, Hays, Garden City, Ottawa, a couple smaller places that couldn't really fit in the map very easily and still be seeable, or Stauffer Communications. My first job was at the Pittsburgh Morning Sun. They also owned the Topeka paper and a few others around the state. Lots of independent papers. McPherson, Manhattan. Manhattan had been Seton family for generations. Emporia, the White family for generations. A lot of smaller papers also, but again, like I said, wouldn't fit the map. 5 years later, there were some changes. Morris Communications, based out of Georgia, came in and bought the Stauffer papers. Papers change hands all the time. You'll see papers on the map, papers not on the map. It seems like almost every paper you could name in Kansas has been bought and sold at least once, maybe twice or more in the last 20 years. So newspapers changing hands, again, isn't all that unusual. Not much of consequence happened over the time from 95 to 2005. And then in 2007, Gatehouse, and I actually had to go back and look this up because I didn't realize it had happened that long ago, bought most of the former Stauffer papers from Morris, except for the Capital Journal. I was working at a paper in Oklahoma that got bought by, sorry. Yeah, long time ago. I was backing up there. I was at the Journal by this time, but the paper that I had previously worked at in Oklahoma had been bought by Morris and then was sold to Gatehouse in 2007. A few years later, there's some changes. 2017, 18, 19, Gatehouse bought the other Harris papers. They also bought some independent papers, for example, well, not really independent, but other ownership by Leavenworth, Newton, or not Newton, Leavenworth, El Dorado, and some places like that. Also over time bought several smaller papers, again, that the mapping would really fit Wellington, Augusta, right in the Wichita area, and some places like that. When I worked at the paper, in Oklahoma, selling from Stauffer to Morris, there were very few changes at all. Actually, in a lot of ways, we got raises, there was a little bit more investment. We got to go to national conferences that Stauffer hadn't been paying for quite so much over the last few years. Gatehouse represents kind of a different kind of owner, though. This is from the University of North California, which did a look at, and their data was about 4 years old now, but they looked at who owned the biggest bulk of newspapers in the country in 2004 and then again in 2014. They kind of divided it up. What you see here is Gannett, which was a news organization, Knight Ridder, which was a news organization. Working your way down, most of those are, Hearst, McClatchy, Scripps. If you've been in the news business, you know those as decades-old news companies. 2014, what you see on the right there now, Digital First Media, Tribune Publishing, New Media Gatehouse, which are all, maybe they have a news focus, but their overall ownership really is an investment bank, a hedge fund, an equity fund, something like that. I spent half a day trying to find this quote, and I know Dave Barry said it, but I could not find it for verification anywhere, so there's a question mark there. And the exact wording might not be quite right, but Ford, if people quit buying F-150 pickups, Ford shuts down a production line. The line that's still working still turns out an F-150 the same quality as it did before. Levi's, anything like that, they can respond by cutting back production but not cutting back on quality. With a newspaper or TV station, other journalism outlets, magazines, your only real option is to cut staff. You lose a little bit, okay, you're not using quite as much paper if you lose readers. So again, part of this didn't happen at the Journal all of a sudden. I used the Internet Wayback Machine and dug up staff listings, and I only focused on news and sports from the Journal at various intervals over the last few years. I came here in '99, and we had a few more people than that, but I couldn't verify it, so I went with the last I could verify, or furthest back I could verify. 2003, 25 full-time news and sports employees at the Journal. 2013, it was down to 22. That's wrong. That should be 2016 down to 19. 2019 down to 5. And this is a little bit out of date. Aaron Anders is still there. Arnie Green is still there. Jason, Gary, and Larry have been replaced by other people. They've left in the last month or two. So please, as a favor to the people that I know that work there, and I don't know, kindred to the people I don't know that work there, if you run into somebody who works at the Journal on the street, don't ask them, hey, do you got anybody there reading copy anymore? Because the answer is no, they don't. They don't appreciate it, and I don't appreciate it either. Yeah, they're in a tough boat. Okay, so what happens when, this is the part you're going to love. What happens when readership and journalism go down? when there aren't as many people covering local news, I'm going to show you just flashes from several research papers. This one from a couple of economists and political scientists, sponsored by the Brookings Institution, published in Journal of Politics, so appeared and all that. Less intense coverage of congressional races. Fewer stories, fewer in-depth stories, fewer hard questions, fewer pinning candidates down. What that leads to, and I'm going to blow up part of this, what that leads to, they found, is if you're not reading about these candidates, you don't care about these candidates, you don't vote for these candidates, civic engagement, voter turnout, all those things go down. This is also the part I figured the league people would like.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that throw 'em a bone.
Right. Another one, they gauged, where was this one at? I don't remember exactly what they looked at. But anyhow, they looked at some places that had sustained drastic cuts to their news organizations between like 2008 and 2010. Again, they found citizens were less engaged. In polling, they found the citizens were less familiar with their House candidates, congressional candidates, less likely to vote, projected lower voter turnout that turned out to happen. Another one, oh, there's the zoomed up part of that one. Less able to evaluate their member of Congress, less likely to express opinions about House candidates, less likely to vote. This one specifically looked at 10 newspapers in California and local elections instead of like the other two that were congressional elections. Again, they found fewer candidates running for mayor, fewer people engaged in city politics, lower voter turnout. Okay, lower voter turnout, less engaged civically, not quite as informed, those are all kind of subjective things. Objectively though, a newspaper not doing its watchdog roles can suck money out of your wallet.
What, sorry?
Suck money out of your wallet. This study, which was done by some economists at the University of Illinois and Notre Dame, analyzed lots and lots of places around the country where news coverage had shrunk or newspapers had closed, and they literally found that bond interest rates, when cities or school districts borrowed money, 5 to 11 basis points higher. Cities, counties, school boards, whoever was borrowing the money, were maybe more likely to do an advance refunding, which might get the bonds paid off sooner, but was more expensive and things like that, without somebody there asking, why are you doing this and what's the alternative and what is this costing? This was about 10 years ago, but it kind of made the news at the time. City in California, about the size of Salina, 40,000, roughly, if I'm remembering right. This has been going on for 8 or 9 years when somebody finally called the newspaper, which happened to be the Los Angeles Times, was the nearest large paper. City manager and city council members voted themselves raises. In a town the size of Salina, the city manager was making, like it says there, $800,000. City commissioners were making, I don't remember, $300,000 or $400,000 a year. California state of California enacted some municipal reforms capping pensions and so forth for municipal employees. So these guys got together and had a charter election, which was a way to get out from under that state law, that had, I think it was 450 people vote out of a city of, like I said, I think it was about 40,000. And nobody's going to city commission meetings as a reporter. Nobody's going to city commission meetings as a citizen. So this kind of stuff all happened in totally open session that anybody could have seen if they'd been there, but nobody was. Several people ended up in jail over that one. Okay, so skipped something. Yeah, I did. I do want to stop for a second again and say, Gatehouse gets a pretty bad rep, and maybe they deserve a lot of it, but they do some pretty good journalism. I've seen some good stuff here. Friday's paper had a story about auto dealership in Wichita that was apparently a nest of cocaine dealing and cars disappearing and insurance fraud and so forth, that as of Sunday, the Wichita Eagle hadn't even touched yet. Neither of any of the Wichita TV stations, as far as able to find. As a guy who brews his own beer, I really appreciated the piece they did, the agriculture piece a while back, about how barley farmers are being kept alive by the craft beer movement and the little networks that are starting up there. I saw something really cool a while back about high school concussions, high school athletes and concussions, that really in-depth chart all kinds of data from hospital emergency rooms all over the country that showed spike September in concussions, which, you know, you would guess that, but it's nice to have the data. And I've seen interviews with Gatehouse executives who say the cuts they're doing right now are a necessary part of restructuring to get these newspapers on a solid footing so that they can grow again. Part of what we were asked to do is, who wants to make some news? What's an alternative if the Journal doesn't do what the Gatehouse execs sometimes say it will do? I'm going to run out of time real quick. We'll do questions and answers. If you wanted to start your own news organization, some things you'd want to think about. Would you want to do print, online, some of both, home delivery, or just racks around town, paid or free? I've talked to a few people in the newspaper business now around the country that I've known for decades, and some people around here who are out of it, just kind of tapping their knowledge. Home delivery, if you wanted to do that in a town the size of Salina, at the level, the volume the Journal was doing it 10 years ago, they say you would need 4 or 5 full-time people just to manage the people who are doing the deliveries. So that's, you know, huge expense to start up with. Does anybody have any preferences? If we were going to, if somebody were, not me, I said we, not me. If somebody were going to start an alternative news organization here, would you want it in print or online, or both, or? Okay. Okay. You'd have to consider staffing, full-time people, freelancers, some mix. Freelancers are great, but you can't always rely on them when something's happening now. Legal structure. Everybody I talked to said incorporate. Incorporate, be it LLC, something like that. Everybody I talked to said you'll need libel insurance, which runs several $1,000s a year per employee, and general liability insurance if your paperboy gets hit by a car or something, or whatever. Yeah, Mike.
You mentioned alternative news sources. In Salina, we have an excellent organization.
I think I know where you're going.
Yeah, Salina Media Connection.
Yes.
That's, you know, we produce YouTube videos, and we're getting more volunteers and more shows. So we're
definitely on the list of things that are already here that someone could leverage if they wanted
yeah,
to.
okay.
How do you pay for it? Current model is, Journal is basically paid for with advertising. Circulation, again, every expert I said says subscription revenues, and if you buy your paper off the rack at Quick Shop or whatever, all that ever pays for, if you're lucky, is the paper, putting the ink on the paper and getting it to that location. Sometimes subscription revenues don't even pay for that. So everything else that the Journal has and does has to be paid for with advertising under the current model. The problem with that, as we've seen, is if you lose readers, you lose advertisers, you lay people off, your quality suffers. So those two things are tied together. It'd be nice if you could make those two things independent and continue to provide a quality product for 15,000 people if you can't sell it to 30,000 people. I've grouped all these together. Donors, white knight investors, foundations. There are examples all over the country of investment groups that have gone in and started a new news organization, started a foundation, or a community foundation already there. Bernie Sanders last week suggested that public funding, which, okay, first I thought, okay, that's Bernie, but then I got to thinking, okay, NPR does that model, PBS does that model to a great degree. So, that's a possibility too. Examples, which is this one?
American Prospect.
Star Tribune in Minnesota. I have a friend who's worked there for like 15 years. Paper went through 2 or 3 sales. Staff was cut to about 15% of what it had been. Local billionaire who also owns one of the local sports teams, Timberwolves, NBA basketball team. Put his own money on the line, bought the paper. Cool thing is he bought it after most of the wealth had been stripped out of it. So he was able to get it for, let's see. Okay. It says, he was able to purchase the paper for 4 times projected annual earnings. 15 years ago, a typical newspaper would sell for 15 times annual earnings. So he got quite a discount because, costs have been cut, employees have been laid off, union contracts have been renegotiated, and he basically set it up as an independent organization. He says, if you guys make money, great, pour it back into the product. If you don't make money, call me and we'll see what we can do. He hired a pro from Time Magazine to run the thing. It's now, 5 years later, it's making a few $1 million a year that they're putting back into investing in the product, hiring new people, growing their online.
Mike, what paper is that?
Star Tribune in Minneapolis.
Okay, thanks.
This is another example in Philadelphia. Philadelphia Inquirer went through several restructurings, bought by an equity firm, sold. I think that happened a couple of times. Local guy came in and set up a foundation. Philadelphia Inquirer, Daily News, and the Philly.com website, set them up, paid off their debts. Again, and this is near the end of the presentation, but honestly, it's the game changer. I'm going to zoom in here. The guy established that the paper should have a public mission rather than profit maximization. And this is a guy who made himself a billionaire, so he's not just some guy who inherited a bunch of money or something and was feeling nice. But I'm going to redo this one with underlining. They see the newspapers as comparable to civic and arts organizations like museums or symphonies as being that essential to the life of a community. That, I read that and I thought, whoa, okay, that's kind of important, yeah. And when you look at the studies I showed you previously about civic engagement, voter turnout, all that stuff, that was a new way of looking at it for me. I first read this a couple of years ago, and it's kind of been noodling in my brain. And Paul and James, you may have been looped into some of those conversations about that too. We're up all the time on Facebook talking about that and other stuff. Lot smaller staff, but they're making a profit. They're operating in the black. They're not having to cut. They're able to reinvest in the community instead of sending the money out to out-of-state owners. Here you go, Mike. How do you get started if you wanted to start something? You could start from scratch. Every newspaper out there started from scratch at some point or other. You could leverage what's already here. Salina Post, KSAL.com, both still have pretty good news organizations. People with a lot of knowledge in the community, people who have been here for 20 years covering news in this community. There's the Spotlight, which is a newspaper started up a couple of years ago in southeastern Salina County. I've picked it up several times at Ad Astra. It's really nicely done. Its focus is roughly a quarter of the county. That could grow, no reason why it couldn't. Salina Media Connection, video production facilities, access to everybody in town with cable, and you can also watch the videos online. That certainly could be a part of the puzzle overall. Also found there are several examples around the country where people have bought papers back from Gatehouse or one of the other equity firms, and like the example I was showing you with in Minneapolis, substantially less than what they originally bought for. You know, much smaller operation and so forth. Those are some options.
Quick question. Given that the Journal is hiring some other folks and may have reporters, and I really don't know, I'm just scanning the audience, I don't see a reporter here, which would be an interesting thing. But nonetheless, my question is, of those organizations you have up there, I think that KSAL is the only one with an active reporter in town. Is that accurate as far as you know?
At the Post, it's Leslie Eichelberry, I know, is still there full-time, and yeah, she's shown up at Salina Tech for things before, in just the last few months, yeah.
Oh, that's true, yeah.
Yeah, KSAL has several people out in the community. Yeah, both of those two do. Spotlight, like I said, geography, it looks like they're attending a lot of school events and things like that in the southeastern part of the county.
Yeah, not in Salina. but in
Right,
South-
right,
yeah.
right. You know, commission meetings and so forth.
Where's Salina? The Salina Post.
They are KINA, Eagle Broadcasting.
Okay.
Yeah.
I hear people talking about it.
Yeah.
but I didn't-
And they have similar organizations in Hayes and Junction City and Great Bend and a few other places too, yeah.
Mike, my impression of the KSAL news is that it doesn't have quite the same slant as the broadcast of KSAL. Would you say that's true? Or not?
Are you talking about opinion versus news or?
I guess the news that goes on the KSAL.com
Right.
is a little different than the broadcast stuff that goes out.
The news on KSAL.com is
Oh.
pretty much the same as the news you would read, or the news on KSAL.com is pretty much the same as the news you would hear on the radio.
Except for the Fox News broadcast that they have on.
Yeah, yeah,
Except for the national.
right.
Okay.
Right.
I've talked to a couple of separate groups in town that are looking at some mix of some of those, both in terms of what's already here.
Kansas Leadership Center's journal
Yeah.
that they put out, and it was about this very topic.
Oh, right, okay.
And I did a really good job of explaining what's happened, you know, in good everyday language of what's happened in papers and how we got here. It also has a couple of examples, one in Prairie Village of a couple that started an online post, and then now after 7 years, it's you pay for access.
There's one like that in McPherson also.
And then there's also one, Kelsey Ryan, former reporter for Wichita Eagle and Kansas City Star,
I was gonna include her in
uh,
this, yeah,
doing a digital startup,
yeah, the Beacon.
focusing on nonprofit online news organization focused on providing in-depth reporting on how communities are impacted by government.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they gave that a couple of examples. I want a non-biased reporter reporting. I don't want just
Sure.
Joe down the street writing his opinion about the city commission meeting or the, you know, and that's huge.
And that's expensive.
I know, it's
Yeah,
huge.
that's expensive.
I wonder, I haven't talked to James about this, but James, you started a Facebook page, right, about 6-8 months ago for people interested in this issue, maybe creating another spot. What's happened with it? Any?
3 people were interested.
Is that right? 3?
Yeah, oh,
Yeah,
What was
3
it called?
people.
yeah. It was, granted, this wasn't a massive public rollout. It was a discussion brainstorming group that focused on a lot of these questions, especially there at the end. You know, start from scratch, leverage, et cetera. It kind of spawned off a closed group that was already active, saying, look, you know, maybe media coverage isn't your bag. If it is, here, we're going to take this into a different forum and have the conversation. And literally 3 people showed up. Now, that may be an issue with regard to the group it spawned off of, or it may reflect something even more depressing. I can't tell you, but yeah, I mean, this topic has been, I think, one of the problems I think that maybe is becoming more salient to us today, perhaps especially today, is the enormity of stuff that we care about to some degree, that we want to keep up with, and how fast stuff is happening in every one of those categories. A newspaper used to be sort of a daily encyclopedia of at least the breaking stuff. And if you had a healthy newspaper, you could afford to pay somebody to work on a longer term project that gave more depth on a perennial issue, or do more than just the president today, the city commission today announced. They could say, hey, look, this is how we got here. This is how we have this tangle of traffic in downtown. Or this is why we have this really bad poor neighborhood in town. Or this is why you're paying so much taxes, and a historical overview. And sometimes all you have to do is comb through your own archives to produce that sort of thing. But, you know, it wasn't just breaking news and stenography. One of the problems that I find with some of the existing sources in town is that if you look at them, and if you think that they are replacements for the Salina Journal, do a word count on how long one of the radio-affiliated news stories is. Just listen to the news breaks, the local news breaks on the radio stations. 3 sentences per topic.
They're writing for radio, which
They
is
are.
different than writing for
It's like all
radio.
headlines.
And I mean, it is what it is. It has its place. It does not replace, however, text, long form, detail, and all the things that newspapers, when they're healthy, are capable of.
I could never write for radio.
No.
That's a skill though. It's not just don't put stuff in. It's a different skill set.
Now, I am not really a venture capitalist by any shade of the imagination. So I'm glad that the conversation about what to do next is happening. It's happening way above my pay grade. What I am interested in doing in the meantime is trying to keep, I guess, the culture of information, engagement, and participation alive amongst all of us regular folks, to the extent it isn't already dead, by trying to get folks to do more on their own in the meantime. I attended a really nice talk by a political scientist at First Presbyterian Church recently about, oh gosh, what was
Oh,
he
it's the
talking
one that I didn't know about until afterwards.
Yeah. Right. He was talking about, and gosh, he was so important that I forgot the crux of his conversation. I can tell you the points that he raised, but the thing was there were no reporters there. And to some extent, that's understandable. How many reporters do they have at the Post, at the Salina Post, at KSAL, running around town, do you think? Couple. So
Maybe 3, yeah.
when we looked at the Salina Journal's decline from 25 or more people back in the day to 2 reporters, Jason Beats and Gary, for me that was...
Well, and when I came to Salina in 1999, KSAL had 5 or 6 reporters.
Yeah.
They were at school board meetings, they were at county commission meetings, they were, yeah.
One of the nice things about KSAL and the radio stations, because they use a primarily online and radio focus, they're going to be recording everything, at least audio, so you can actually hear audio clips. they're also going to be posting stuff posting video. Now, SMC, Salina Media Connection, of course, is a video medium. One of the interesting things about the way radio covers things is that it, in some ways, is a little bit like what reading a newspaper used to be like. If you're like me, you didn't read the Salina Journal cover to cover any day. You had certain topics or sections of interest. You would scan headlines and subheads, maybe the first paragraph or so, to see if this was something that you were interested in, and then you would read more or move on to the next thing. To some extent, radio enables that phenomenon to exist because they can give you the headlines in the local news segment, and then if you're interested, you can go to at least a video clip or an audio clip of the program. With longer form things like Salina Media Connection, you don't necessarily have that broken off part of getting the word out there. You don't have an analog to headlines as much that says, hey, this content is available here if you're interested. And if not, you can skip. Radio can just rattle off a 60-second local news thing, and that tells you that they've got some content somewhere that you can go and look for.
And they often.
Well, I think that this speaks to Melody's question as well, that people also look to an editorial page where there are people who, whether you agree or disagree, dissect the meaning of those meetings. And by the way, there's been a lot of Salina Journal editorial page content I find reprehensible, but there's been some good stuff along with it. So you need that kind of focus. So that's one thing. Another, I think, that's really important is who funds it. And it seems to me there's been some discussion on Facebook and among some people interested about having a philanthropic donor core in Salina. You've got to have enough money to fund a reporter base and then have a product that people will then subscribe to. I would suspect that the $17 to $25 you pay for Salina Journal could be siphoned to a place that people might be willing to pay. And Michael Smith's first point was, you need to be willing to pay for your news.
Yeah.
Right.
He was unaware, however, that by the time he came to speak in Salina, the Journal was down to 2 reporters, and that ended, I think, within a week. So it's difficult to watch this spiral happen, and unless you've got a few million sitting around, tens of millions sitting around to do much about it.
I'm curious, if you were talking about 4 years of profits, that's how much it costs to buy out someplace?
Earnings, yeah.
Yeah, structure.
Earnings.
Down
You have-
from
from-
15.
Right, so
several years.
do you have an idea how much that is? I mean, when you talk
Yeah.
about millions, I think
Yeah.
about the Greater Salina Community Foundation, which has
Right.
millions and millions, and
The
just is
Journal
looking for places to use it,
12 years ago, the Journal was making $1.5 million, $2 million, in that range, a decade or 2 ago.
but now?
I don't know.
You don't know. There's no way to know, is there?
Well, and the hedge funds are looking instead of for a 15% return for a 35% return, which means that more of that money, vis-a-vis cuts in staff, is going to the hedge fund.
They're looking for higher returns. In a lot of cases, they're looking for how do we pay off the debt we incurred in making this
That's right.
purchase
Right.
that the old family chains a lot of times didn't have.
Right.
So, yeah, you've got to make your debt payments.
It's just, with a city of 47,000 people, if your news staff is in single digits,
Yeah.
you are not giving an accurate portrayal of what the community life is about, number one. And I mean, that's
You're hitting
completely
some high
non-part.
points.
Yeah.
You're hitting the obvious.
You're going where you can go, you're going where traditionally things were deemed to be important. But the more that this goes on, those traditionally deemed to be important things, like city commission, like school board, like Kansas Corporation Commission, all these different things, they aren't so important anymore as people perceive them, because we've lost the heritage of knowing about them, caring about them, seeing why they matter. We're talking about kind of like sort of death spirals in many ways. You know, you lose readers, you lose advertising, you lose money, you lose more reporters, you lose coverage, quality of coverage, in-depth coverage, et cetera, and it all just keeps repeating. The same thing happens civically.
Well, and the irony is the importance to the city commission, to the county commission, to the school board, that they are being monitored or watched and like that, because that there is a healthy tension that comes from that when it's not there, you end up with the California story. So that it's really a very serious, important relationship. Or as
It has to be someone who knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
And what the history is and so forth.
Thank you.
10 years ago, a guy was on vacation, and so they sent me to cover a housing authority meeting. Well, I get back, okay, I sit through the meeting, I kind of take some notes, ask a couple of questions. I get back, and Scott Sear's like, what?
yeah.
Because they're talking about building housing. Well, okay. Housing authority always just bought existing housing. This was the first time in decades they'd actually talked about building housing, and I had no clue. Major shift. I'd been there several years. I was guy with reporting experience. I didn't know this was a major shift. So the person there, it's not just enough to be there. You gotta have somebody there who knows what they're doing,
Yes.
knows the history, knows what kind of questions to ask, and that's a good example of a guy, fairly bright guy who just had no clue that day.
The rules, the traditions, the history, the personalities, the subtext, the conflicts that have happened in the past that are now kind of submerged and we're all being polite to one another, those things form the background and give, they inform your ability to ask smart questions or recognize something that's important. One of the reasons why long-term residents are better at this sort of thing than people who sort of just zip in and zip out. And to some extent, that's a metaphor for the purchasing trends of the past years. These are out-of-state owners. These are, out-of-Kansas owners. You could believe that, like, the Harris family cared about journalism.
Yeah.
It was traditional, et cetera. Maybe it was a noblesse oblige kind of thing. Maybe it was along the lines of an older model of sort of philanthropy and a respectable business. But you could at least buy that. Now,
plausible.
Yeah, now everybody's out of state, everybody's nibbling up these other outlets, and then they're shrinking. They say they're shrinking in order to expand later. I'm not real clear on what the model for such expansion is. I don't really know anybody who is. And it all seems sort of extractive of value from our area based on minimal knowledge and minimal concern. There's a trend in management, of course, to say that you don't need to know anything about an industry to be a good manager. If you can manage a widget factory, you can transfer over and manage a auto factory or a food factory or whatever it might be. The key thing is to know management. That sort of is disrespectful to the actual work that goes involved into making widgets or cars or whatever it might be. I think there's some validity in that argument that management is itself a skill, but ownership and operation of something like a newspaper it's very dangerous to lump it all in with any other commodity out there.
I think you can get a sense of where the model is going already by looking, and so I'm phrasing this carefully. I want to be clear on phrasing it carefully, given the Wichita story that Mike referred to about the corrupt car agency. But Home Automotive is now sponsoring, if you will, the good news section.
That had anything to do with it.
No, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that a large economic entity in this area is funding a good news project. Of course, everybody wants good news, But then what's the relationship of Home Automotive to the Good News? It's a built-in advertisement for them, of course.
Sure.
But so I think this gives you an idea about what direction it goes. And if there were, for example, a similar scandal, and I'm not saying there is, but if there were at Home Automotive, would there be coverage if Home Automotive is funding the Good News Project?
You stand a better chance of coverage happening under older models of journalism and older actual structures that have kind of.
Yeah, and under independent management of whatever, and independent funding of whatever kind of, yet I think we have to recognize here that any funder of sufficient magnitude is going to have some self-interest.
Sure.
In that, right?
One of the things that Mike brought up with the Pointer Institute, the Lenfest Institute, and the purchasing of the newspaper and considering it part like a civic group or an arts group, that's good. But it also puts the emphasis on the positive. Everybody likes a symphony or an art museum. It's very rare, and usually only in big cities, where symphonies or art museums offend anybody.
Right.
So the positive spin is a newspaper can be a wonderful, we all feel good about the fact that we have an art museum or a symphony. And even under the old models, I think newspapers tended to do a lot of local boosterism, not all of which is bad. You should have something that makes you feel good about your community. But a newspaper, if it's really going to fulfill its function in a civic ecosystem, has to also be a predator sometimes, and not just a cute fluffy bunny we want to pet.
Now, you misunderstood that comment.
No, do you mean the civic and arts organization?
To me, that had more to do with thinking of the newspaper or the journalism as the heartbeat of the community. And the connective and how we do our work as opposed to fun and good and let's feel good.
I think that
because
those
the arts
examples-
museums, the art should be asking the hard questions.
I agree with you.
Just like, okay,
Yeah,
so
I mean,
let's just be clear.
it's just, I think that the choice of those as the example puts the emphasis on, oh, this is a nice thing that everybody likes. Who doesn't like
I
a
did not
symphony or
agree with
whatever?
that.
I think you're actually making a mistake about charities. I don't think the local museums are necessarily that willing. They're willing to make people feel uncomfortable. Salina Art
Yeah.
Center is an example of that. But I also think you're misunderstanding a nonprofit is that you have to live up to your mission. And so a mission of that, a nonprofit for a newspaper would be completely different than the symphonies. And so you have to realize that is your protection also
Right.
with your donors or your subscribers and everything. So I think, to me, it makes sense that journalism needs to go toward a nonprofit.
I
I think
agree.
it could be a real protection in a certain way.
I agree, and I'm not saying that Salina's Symphony or Salina's Art Center or any of these other places, I mean, good gosh, Martha's in the room, I wouldn't make it out alive, are fluffy bunnies.
No, I understand that, but I also think you're not quite getting the idea of what a nonprofit can really do for the group itself.
I think newspapers should be nonprofit or publicly funded, and I always have. I've always been more critical of the old model of journalism where it was owned by the Harris family or primarily funded through advertising. Because if Dillon's can put out a big ad, Dillon's has more clout. And while reporters will tell you that no, there really isn't any kind of, you can't write a bad story about Dillon's because they take out a circular every week, that is true. There are instances and occasions where a powerful entity in a community, be it commercial, traditional, whatever, has a very, let's leave no fingerprints, influence on how aggressively something is covered or not covered and so on. And it primarily works through sort of an old boy network to some extent in smaller communities, and then bottom line advertising kind of thing. If you upset the wrong person, they have a lot of influence to try to bring you down, and the leverage point is advertising. So I have always been more critical of the kind of journalism we miss now. Actually well-staffed newspapers, but they are funded through.
It had a good run.
Yeah, it did, and it
worked
allowed.
pretty well most of the time for decades.
It allowed an interesting compromise between the journalistic ethic of truth-telling and getting to the truth and being objective and so on, not picking sides, versus just a house organ that just says whatever the owner wants. You could have that ethic inside journalism for a long time. I'm wondering whether or not that can happen when the people buying up newspapers have no background, interest, or concern about journalism as a profession with its own ethics and integrity.
Have we, or anyone had the opportunity to look at Gatehouse's history with other newspapers and see what in fact they have or have not done? And we could look at what our potential future might be.
Their history is fairly recent. Don't quote me on exact dates, but they came out of bankruptcy 5 or 6 years ago, and that's when they kind of went on their latest buying.
So we don't have anything to
There's-
look at to say this is potentially what's going to happen to the Salina Journal. I think it's a write-off.
There have been a few papers that have closed.
I think it's a write-off. I think
Yeah.
the Salina Journal is gone. Actually, I spoke to the gentleman who just left from the managing director, and he in essence only would say, money is the bottom line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No surprise.
But, if money was the bottom line for the Journal 20 years ago, Journal 20 years ago, like I said, was making
It had a heart.
$2 million. Well,
Right.
you know, if money's the bottom line, Journal 20 years ago was making maybe $2 million a year. Typical profit margin for a newspaper 20 years ago was, guess,
4%.
you're a businessman.
Yeah, I said 4%, what do I know?
What's the answer?
4% would have got you fired, 20% would have got you suspended. Typical newspaper operating margins 20 years ago were in the 25, 30, even 40% range.
Oh, margin not.
I think of it like
Margin not
farming.
profit,
Yeah,
that's a
yeah,
big difference,
yeah,
okay.
Sorry.
I think of it like farming. You can buy a plot of land and farm very aggressively without regard to the long-term health of the land, the soil, the ecosystem. You could dump a lot of pesticides and a lot of stuff that's going to run off into the streams or the groundwater, and it's going to mess it up for the surrounding neighbors. But maybe you can farm that way for a few short years and make big-time profits that will look great on a balance sheet, and then you can sell it to some sucker, or just, you know, write it off as a loss once those profit margins drop too low. Meanwhile, everybody who's a long-term resident of that area is suffering because of the damage you did. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they have a vision for how to hack, and
I
then
would
build
hope
up.
so. But no matter what your business model is, it's very, very hard to do anything when this is your customer base, and that's very unlikely to change.
Yeah.
If I was looking at those trend lines and somebody said, hey, let's buy a newspaper.
If you go to a meeting or something and there's no reporter there, but you think it's important for the community to know about, appoint yourself your own secretary, take your own notes, write them up, and share them via whatever medium that you like. You don't necessarily have to conform to any journalistic standards, but at least, I mean, granted, it'd be nice if you did voluntarily, on your own time, create a well-crafted reportorial piece and share it for free with the community. But if you just let folks know your take on the meeting that you were at, you think is important, but nobody from the media covered, it's a way of at least, until we figure out what the future is going to be, keeping a little bit of knowledge about what's happening around us alive until something takes the place of what we may have lost.
The
That's like
Lutheran
Karen,
approach
what's
to
her
journalism.
name? Karen, who writes about the city commission meeting. Karen Shade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She did that. She's appointed herself as the
Yeah.
county commission reporter, and KSAL posted on their website.
Yeah.
Is she getting paid for that? Do you know?
No,
I
she
don't
does
think
that
I
volunteer.
kind of like that Lutheran approach.
Yeah, I mean, for the time
Every
being,
person a reporter.
you know,
Yeah.
it'd be nice if every person, you know, could write and understood journalism and all these other different things, but in the absence of all of us doing that and investing, I mean, it's one of those instances where kind of like big corporate interests are doing this, and our solution at the moment is for us to volunteer to subsidize the survival of our community.
So a quick question, Mike, in your experience, if you sent something like that to news@salina.com, would it get printed, do you think?
is theoretical. This is my coverage of the zoning board.
Yeah.
Probably not. But if there was something important going on that had been missed, like they gave themselves $800,000 a year
Yeah.
raises, probably so.
Yeah.
As
Nobody,
a starting point.
nobody would care if, where the scoop came from, if it checked out, and they'd happily use it. But would Mike get paid for the scoop?
No.
Well, without going on about it, there's an example of last night's city commission meeting where they appropriated to the public 75% of the cost of new building.
I hadn't
While
heard,
the,
yeah.
Objective science called for a 60-40 split, meaning taxpayers are now paying more than they would have ordinarily. Without mentioning any possible real estate connections to the commission.
It was 95.5 in some discussions
Yes.
earlier.
That's
Yeah,
right.
okay.
Yeah, it was, and they came down from that,
Yeah.
perhaps because of people being aware of it.
Well, our time is up. I am Lori Tro. I am the president of the Salina League of Women Voters, and I want to thank James and Mike for coming and giving our talk. And our next one will be October the second Tuesday, and our topic will be the Equity Council for USD 305. Correct?
I think that's right.
And then in November, we are going to have a topic discussion on the dangers of jewels and vaping.
Ah,
That will be November. We still have some cookies. If you haven't signed in, please do so. And if you'd like to become a member, let us know.
Okay.
Okay,
So-
thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for the lead.